Imagine being stranded in the heart of Paris on New Year's Eve. It's 9 o'clock in the evening. The Arc de Triomphe towers above you, bathed in golden light, while the streets pulse with the energy of 1,000 revelers counting down to midnight. Laughter, music, champagne bottles popping. It's a night of celebration for everyone but you. You're exhausted, no phone, no money, a heavy rucksack on your back. You don't speak a word of French. And worst of all, you think you've just missed your last chance to make it back to safety. Your return flight is in 2 days. A stranger approaches, a kind face in the crowd, an offer of help. But what if that helping hand belonged to a predator? This is the terrifying reality that Jeanette O'Keefe faced on the last day of the year 2001, before vanishing into the shadows of the City of Light, and tragically being found lifeless 2 days later. I'm Francois, your host. A lawyer by trade, I have a deep passion for the investigative process and the mysteries of true crimes. With me, you'll uncover the lesser-known stories, the ones that slip through the cracks but deserve to be told. So, my friends, make yourself comfortable, brew your favorite drink, and get ready for this week's episode of Espresso Crime. In the early morning of Tuesday, the 2nd of January 2001, two 12-year-old boys set off with their dog for a routine walk around their neighborhood in the Cité des Musiciens, a low-income housing estate in Les Mureaux, a suburb of Paris. The sky is grey and the streets are slick with the dampness of recent rain. Their dog, usually playful, suddenly becomes fixated on something in an abandoned parking lot cluttered with garbage and debris. He tugs on the leash, dragging the boys toward a discarded sleeping bag. Something about the way it lies on the ground, its bulging form, stops them in their tracks. One of the boys hesitantly reaches out and nudges it with his foot. The bag is heavier than expected, unnaturally so. A lump rises in his throat as he realizes what they've just stumbled upon. Panic sets in. The boys sprint home, calling out for help. One of their fathers, alerted by their frantic shouts, follows them back to the lot and immediately calls the police. Within minutes, emergency services arrive. Paramedics carefully unfasten the cord wrapped tightly around the top of the sleeping bag and reveal what lies inside. The lifeless body of a young Caucasian woman, likely in her late 20s. Her face is bruised, her body twisted unnaturally. There is nothing on her, no wallet, no identification, no phone. A Jane Doe, if there ever was one. Jean-Marc Bloch, head of the Versailles Criminal Police, receives the call. Another homicide, another crime scene. The few details about the morbid find conveyed to him over the phone tell him that this will be a difficult case before he even arrives. And he is right. There is nothing to go on. The woman's face is unfamiliar, her clothes unremarkable. An oversized plaid shirt, a t-shirt, sweatpants. The tampon still within her allows the police to exclude the possibility of rape. The only thing that stands out is the brutality of her injuries. 13 blunt force wounds, suggesting her attacker unleashed violence with little self-control. The autopsy will later confirm the cause of death was strangulation, in fact, double strangulation. Once manually and again with a thin cord. Strange, very strange. Her liver is ruptured, possibly from a fall or an impact. Under her nails, traces of skin. The presence of foreign hairs in the sleeping bag hints at a struggle, but DNA analysis is tongue-tied. Whoever did this is not in any police database. The police is also certain she was not killed where she was discovered. The sleeping bag she was found in is dry, and the first days of the year 2001 were met with rain. For the investigators, the first challenge is the most basic. Who is she? Without a name, there is no past to investigate, no connections to trace. They circulate her image, show it to the locals. No one recognizes her. Surveillance cameras in the neighborhood, 5 of them, offer nothing useful. She does not appear in any footage. It is as if she materialized from nowhere. While the police are grasping at shadows, nearly 15,000 kilometers away in Melbourne, Australia, a family is consumed by worry. Kevin and Susan O'Keefe have not heard from their daughter Jeanette in days. It isn't like her. Jeanette, 28, is studying in France, fulfilling a long-held dream of immersing herself in French language and culture. a real-life Emily in Paris. She was supposed to board a flight to New York on January the 2nd to reunite with her sister Denise and a friend. She never arrived. The O'Keefes have tried calling the student residence where she was staying in Savigny-sur-Orge. Nothing. Jeanette is gone, and no one knows where. On January the 9th, desperate and out of options, her mother files a missing person report with Australian authorities. The report is relayed to France. The moment her name crosses his desk, Jean-Marc Bloch feels it. A shift. His hard-earned detective's sixth sense tells him that the nameless woman in the sleeping bag is no longer nameless. She is Jeanette O'Keefe. Her family is thousands of miles away and unaware that their worst fears have already come true. Their child is dead. He is now laden with the unenviable task of informing them that single one news that parents never ever want to hear. The news of Jeanette's death is devastating to her parents, two sisters and brother. With no time to process the news, Denise and her husband fly to France. They do not speak French, so Paris's Australian consul is appointed to support their visit. Bloch meets them in his office, his promise firm: they will find out what happened. They will find who did this to her. But promises in homicide investigations are fragile things. The fact that Jeanette was an Australian tourist makes the finding of her lifeless body in the suburbs of Paris all the more incoherent. What could a tourist from down under be possibly doing in an impoverished housing estate in the suburbs of Paris? The police try to piece together Jeanette's last days, starting with interviewing students at the student accommodation she had been staying. The portrait of an unassuming, gentle person soon emerges. Jeanette wasn't the kind of person to attract danger. She was not a partygoer and wasn't reckless. She had few friends in Paris, mostly acquaintances from her French language classes. She was shy, reserved, making the randomness of her death all the more unsettling. The police further learned she had arranged to spend New Year's Eve with a French woman named Elise, a casual acquaintance who had invited her to celebrate with friends. Elise had even offered Jeanette a place to stay for her last nights in France. They were meant to meet at the Mairie de Clichy metro station. Elise waited for an hour. Jeanette never showed up. Jeanette often admitted feeling overwhelmed by Paris, struggling to find her way through the city's labyrinthine metro system. Could she have gotten lost? The police entertain that theory until their attention turns to Anthony Martin, a 40-year-old New Zealander studying French at the same school as her. His connection to Jeanette's disappearance is rather significant, and you will soon see concerning. Anthony admits to them being a casual friend of Jeanette. Back in New Zealand, his French teacher had suggested he look out for her. Jeanette had just arrived in Paris, knew no one, and didn't speak the language. Anthony, happy to oblige, reached out. He wasn't particularly well connected in the city either, and like Jeanette, was there to learn the language. A friendship of sorts developed. They met for coffee, wandered through Parisian streets, and did a bit of sightseeing together, two outsiders trying to find their footing in a foreign city. Anthony proceeds to tell the police that, on the evening of December 31st, at around 7 p.m, Jeanette had called him, distressed. Elise hadn't shown up. She had nowhere to go. Could she stay with him? He said yes, and they agreed to meet at around 9 p.m. in front of a restaurant. Anthony arrived at the rendezvous point almost an hour late to find that she was gone. He waited about 20 minutes, then decided to wander around the city and left. He is, as far as anyone knows, the last person to have contact with her. That alone is enough cause for the police to search his flat. They find nothing. Well, not quite. Something about his cell phone data doesn't add up. At 8:30 p.m, a full 30 minutes before he was supposed to meet Jeanette, Anthony's phone pings off a tower near the Champs-Élysées. If he was there at that time, he couldn't have been late. Conclusions? Anthony Martin lied to them. The police arrest him. He denies everything, but the walls are closing in. The interrogation drags on, and eventually, Anthony cracks. Sort of. Yes, he did lie. But not for the reason they think. With some embarrassment, he confesses to the police that he showed up late on purpose because he was, well, annoyed with her. He explains that the week before he had invited Jeanette for a home-cooked Christmas dinner, but, feeling unwell, she cancelled on him as he was putting the food on the plates. A few days later, she left him waiting for her for 45 minutes in the cold, only to call and cancel on him again. Also, he adds, The last time she had stayed over, he had suffered terrible back pain after giving up his bed for her and opting to sleep on the floor. Not an experience he cared to repeat. With no hard evidence against him, the police let him go. But he's not off the hook just yet. The DNA results are still pending. And if they point to him, there will be no more second chances. They'll have their man. For now, the investigation must continue on the assumption that Anthony might not have been very gallant, but had not killed Jeanette. The last confirmed sighting of Jeanette O'Keefe was on the Champs-Élysées, somewhere between her final phone call to Martin and the discovery of her body in Les Mureaux. She vanished. Champs-Élysées is the heart of Paris, in many ways more so than the Eiffel Tower, so you may well wonder how an examination of surveillance cameras failed to locate and track Jeanette like the authorities brilliantly did with the Boston bombers. This might have been because of the sheer numbers of revelers on that day, making it next to impossible to locate and let alone track anybody. Also, in 2001, the number of surveillance cameras in Paris doesn't compare to what it is now. Investigators consider the possibility that she never made it onto a train that night, that she didn't get lost, but was instead intercepted by someone, a stranger, a predator. They recall the case of Susanna Zetterberg, a Swedish student murdered in 2008 after entering a fake taxi, a case that Espresso Crime will bring to your screen soon. But they find out that Susanna's killer, Bruno Chollet, was behind bars when Jeanette disappeared. He cannot be him. It's been 2 months and Anthony's DNA results are in. To his great relief, it's not a match. His passport is returned to him. The investigation is running in circles, but a new idea emerges. For one thing is clear, the location of Jeanette's body suggests familiarity with the surroundings. What if the killer is local? The police begin calling in all the single men from the Cité des Musiciens for DNA testing. 120 tests are undertaken, only 6 fail to show up. The results of those who did the test are all negative. Damn. After that, well, the investigation grinds to a halt, or certainly slows down, because it is not until 2008 that another attempt to identify the DNA found under Jeanette's fingernails is made. By then, science has made leaps and bounds, and lo and behold, a match is made against one Adriano Araujo da Silva. Adriano's genetic stamp landed in the French DNA database after the Brazilian-born French national, caught driving without a license, figured that ramming into a traffic officer was a genius way to dodge a fine. And here is the real kicker. The result is all the more not surprising because Adriano's name is not unfamiliar to the police. Remember the 6 people that failed to show up for DNA? Well, over the years, the police did their very best to obtain their samples by consent. Something particularly difficult to do lawfully if the suspect refuses and has no criminal record. On paper, Adriano is an ordinary man, barely remarkable, a father of 3, a man with no real career, just another face in the crowd of the Cité des Musiciens, the low-income housing estate in Les Mureaux where he lives. Born in Brazil, Adriano's early life is marked by instability. He grows up in a fractured home, bouncing between relatives, never truly belonging anywhere. His mother, struggling to raise him alone, eventually sends him to live with his father, a man who already has another family. In an effort to give Adriano legitimacy, his father falsifies documents, registering him as the twin brother of a child born to his wife. Adriano becomes a ghost, existing in the cracks of bureaucracy, carrying a name that isn't quite his, in a life that never truly feels like his own. When his father moves to French Guiana in search of work, Adriano follows. He is still a child, and this new life is no easier. There is no real family waiting for him, no warmth. He drifts. By the time he reaches adulthood, he decides to leave South America entirely, chasing opportunity in mainland France. But opportunity is not what he finds. Without an education, without connections, Adriano scrapes by on odd jobs. Construction work, deliveries, handyman tasks. He moves to Les Mureaux, a Parisian suburb where cheap housing is easy to find. He builds a life, but never a future. People who know him describe him as reserved, quiet, someone who keeps to himself. Not unfriendly, but not particularly sociable either. A man who blends in, a man you wouldn't look at twice in the street. Yet, behind closed doors, Another side of Adriano emerges. Former partners later recount stories of his temper: short, unpredictable, dangerous. To the world, he appears calm, almost detached. But to the women in his life, he is something else entirely. A man who could switch from affectionate to violent in an instant. A man who believes in control. When he lashes out, it's never without reason, at least not in his mind. His victims deserve it. They've provoked him, they've disrespected him. At the time of Jeanette O'Keefe's murder, Adriano was living alone in a small apartment in the Cité des Musiciens. He has no stable job, no wife, just a girlfriend he loves very much, no clear direction. But what he does have is a darkness inside him, one that has been growing, unchecked, for years. Adriano is arrested. At first he denies everything. Then when faced with the DNA evidence, he changes his story. He says he saw Jeanette being harassed by a group of young men near where he lives, stepped in to help, and she scratched him in fear. But the DNA isn't just under her nails, it's in the sleeping bag, on stray hairs, on the body itself. Adriano's got to do better than that. Nothing like a night's sleep in a police cell to refresh the memory. Okay, you caught me in a lie. Here is what happens, he tells the police. Yes, he did meet Jeanette on the Champs-Élysées that night. She was lost, alone, vulnerable. He offered to take her back to his place. She agreed. One thing led to another, and they had sex. Later, when he wanted more, she refused. He became violent. He struck her with a metal bar, then strangled her. Twice. When it was over, he panicked. He wrapped her in the sleeping bag and threw her from his fourth-floor balcony. That explained the damage to her liver, the fractured but bloodless injuries. Then he did what killers often do, tried to make her disappear. He dumped her body in the abandoned lot where the boys found her. The police don't believe his account, at least the parts about what happened to Jeanette once she was in his place. For one thing, the forensics police is very clear that Jeanette did not have sexual intercourse of any kind. If we consider Adriano's explosive temper, it is more likely that Adriano made advances, and Jeanette's refusal to be intimate with him triggered that darkness in him, and he killed her. The retributions of a man who will not be denied. 2 months later, Adriano da Silva retracts everything. He says the police manipulated him into a confession. He will remain steadfast in his denials to the end, adding that he's only answerable to God. The trial begins on the 3rd of January in 2012, 11 years almost to the day of Jeanette's death. Jeanette's siblings are in attendance. In court, Adriano is subdued, not necessarily combative, except for his refusal to change his story. He insists that Jeanette left his apartment alive. He argues she must have met someone else after their supposed argument. His lawyers do their best to make this look more probable. But, unable to answer questions arising from his explanations, his lawyer changes to yet another version, where this time Jeanette would have seduced him on the train and have sexual relationship with him in the toilet of that train. To the family and even Adriano's own lawyers, the suggestion is vile, disrespectful, and grotesque. An unnecessary character assassination from a man who, seeing his fate pretty much sealed, should have mustered the little moral decency left in him to express remorse. But remorse, regret, empathy are not in attendance in court. No matter, the jury does not take very long to find a guilty verdict. He is sentenced to 30 years with a minimal parole of 20 years. He appeals, and in 2013 his sentence is upheld. If early release is denied, he will be 63 years old when he sees freedom again. Jeanette O'Keefe's story is not just about loss, it is about how a young woman full of hope and promise was swallowed by the very city she adored. The streets she once wandered with fascination became the very place where she took her last steps, alone and vulnerable. To me, this tragedy carries a personal touch because Paris is my city of birth, and through a convergence of bad luck and missed opportunities, Paris failed her. What are your thoughts on Anthony Martin's actions, or indeed his inactions? Should he be blamed for not rushing to Jeanette's aid that night, despite his reservations after their history? Or would that be unfair, given that he could never have imagined the tragic chain of events his hesitation would set in motion? What is clear is that these are terrible, terrible thoughts that this poor man will have to live with for the rest of his life. We wish him well. And then there is Adriano Araujo da Silva. Not just a killer, but a man who, when given the chance to acknowledge his crime and show even the smallest flicker of regret, instead, as the final act of cruelty, chose to desecrate Jeanette's memory. But if this story leaves us with something, it should be with thoughts for Jeanette's family. They lived with this nightmare for over a decade, learning to mourn their dear daughter and sister across continents, fighting for justice in a foreign land, having had to listen to a man twist her memory of their daughter and sister with further lies as if the taking of her life was not enough. They deserved better. Jeanette deserved better. I hope you found this episode of Espresso Crime thought-provoking. If you did, please consider leaving a like. It really helps the channel grow. Next week, I'll be bringing you another gripping story about the execution of an entire family in the beautiful mountainous region of Haute-Savoie. Be sure to be at the rendezvous. Until the next episode, take care of yourselves and of each other.